Let's face it, we don't really get taught how to learn in schools. We're given exams, tests, assignments, and are told what to learn, but not actually how to learn. So we spend years and years of our schooling using these really ineffective studying techniques that often leaves us frustrated when we don't get those high results that we wanted. In this video, I'm going to go through study techniques that are proven to be very effective when it comes to retention of information and being able to apply this when it comes to exam time. Hi everyone, my name is Rhoda and I'm a doctor working in the UK, and it's my mission to pass on as much knowledge to you guys as possible. So in this video, I really wanted to talk about different studying techniques that I picked up and used whilst I was in medical school. So some of these techniques have been really helpful in terms of getting me consistently high grades. I ended up actually graduating in the top 5% of our year. So the reason I'm saying that is there are so many inefficient ways that people are studying. I have worked as a tutor with GCSE and A-level students, and have found throughout the years that unfortunately to this day, people are still using techniques that are outdated and have been proven to be ineffective. This is the kind of video that I wished I had when it came to studying. So before we go into the main part of this video, I really want to talk about a principle that's really important, and that is having a good study ethos. So with myself personally, when it came to exam time, I would always go in with the attitude, with the intention of giving it my 110%. The reason for that is I wanted to do justice to myself, justice to my capabilities. And there's nothing worse than looking back once you've been given your results that you wish you could have done more, or you didn't work hard enough, or you didn't study hard enough. So it's all about making sure that you go in with that intention of giving it your all, because the top marks are there. You might as well try and reach for them. And I found that it almost turned into a bit of a game, like a competition with myself. I try and better myself when it came to each exam. So I got 70%, next time I'm going to try and get 75%, next time I'm going to try and get 80%. And it's almost as if you're treating it as, you know, people running 5K and you're constantly trying to beat your personal best. So the first time you ran it in half an hour, then you figured out some techniques, you improve your training, then you shaved off another couple of minutes, then you shaved off another couple of minutes. It's constantly trying to better yourself and constantly trying to beat your personal best. And there comes a sense of enjoyment out of that as well when you see the fruits of your own labour, knowing that you've put in the effort and have done justice to yourself. Next thing that's so important and so crucial is self-discipline. Lots of people have different interpretations of what this means, but for me, it's the ability to stay focused on my goals, to stay focused on the task on hand. So how can someone do that? How can you stay focused and minimize distractions? And it all comes down to having a self-awareness of what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. So when you know what your strengths are, you can play to them. And when you know what your weaknesses are, you can minimize them. So for me, it was, what are my strengths? I knew that my optimum time of studying was in the morning. I knew then I'll be most focused, less likely to be distracted. So there's no point in me trying to study when, you know I'm not going to be in that right mindset. And for me, that was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon after having lunch. There's that slump that you get. And I thought there's no point doing that. So I'd optimize my time around intervals that I knew I would be most efficient and most able to focus. Weaknesses that I had included every single time I sit down at that desk, after about 5 minutes, I'd start getting hungry, I'd feel really thirsty, and then I'd use it as a really vague excuse to leave the desk, go to the kitchen, and lo and behold, I've spent an hour, 2 hours away from my desk. So that was a distraction, that was a weakness. So what did I do to mitigate that? I'd keep snacks in my drawer, I'd keep a glass of water beside me, so I've minimized my distraction. Discipline, like any other skill, requires building habits. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's all about cultivating that habit. So over time, it becomes something second nature and becomes much more easier. Let's talk about the main point of this whole video, and that is how to actually study. How can we absorb all this information that we need to absorb, keep it in our head, and be able to apply it when it comes to exam time? And before we get into that, we really need to talk about ways in which people approach their studying that is not necessarily the right way or the most effective way. And that is assuming that learning is just purely about memorization of facts. Repeat it to yourself enough times, it's finally incorporated into your head, now I'm going to apply it to my exam. Unfortunately, that is proven to be very ineffective. And To put that into context, there are these really distinct psychological processes. So something called maintenance rehearsal, and that's the way in which we encode information, how we memorize, and that is through pure repetition. Eventually it will stick in your head. But the problem with that is you've not really understood the why and the how of a fact that you're trying to learn. That plays into something called elaborative rehearsal, and that is taking in information and actually trying to understand it. What is the why and the how of this fact I'm trying to learn? We know that is proven to be a much more effective way of remembering something when you've understood the key underpinning kind of sense of it. So I'm going to use an example, and that is cardiac function and its anatomy. So let's say one fact that you had to learn: left side of the heart, so the left ventricle and the atrium, have a much more thicker muscle compared to the right side of the heart. So that's one fact. So let's say you try to memorize that fact without really appreciating why and how. So when it comes to exam time, the person who purely memorized this statement is going to be given a question of something along the lines of which side of the heart pumps blood around the body. And unfortunately, you're not able to answer that question because you've only learned this fact of the left side of the heart has a thicker muscle compared to the right side. How is that linked together? What was the why and the how of it? Now let's use elaborative rehearsal. So the left side of the heart, ventricle and the atrium have a much thicker muscle compared to the right side. Why is that the case? The reason for that is the left side of the heart has to have a bigger muscle mass because it has to pump blood around the whole body, as opposed to the right side, which only has to pump it into the lungs. So you can already start seeing these connections. We go a little bit further. We say, how can we measure the amount of blood that's being pumped out of the heart? And that's through something called the cardiac output. And what is a cardiac output? It's a stroke volume times by the heart rate. So you've already started making a connection in terms of how is something measured. And then you can even go a little bit further and say, what happens when the cardiac output is affected? So what happens when the stroke volume is affected? Or what happens when the heart rate is affected? How can they be affected? So for example, in heart failure, you have weakened heart muscle, which will reduce the amount of blood being pumped out of the body, which reduces the cardiac output. So can you see where I'm trying to go here? So you see that all these seemingly random facts start coalescing together and forming a concept, and that is conceptual understanding. So you start slowly forming a conceptual map in your head, and that is when your note-taking can become more effective as well, because you can start mapping things out into this concept, linking all these things together, always asking yourself the why and the how of a fact that you're learning. We know that those connections where someone approaches their learning in that way are much more stronger, as opposed to someone who's purely memorizing something for the sake of memorization. So now that you've got this down, now that you've got the understanding and you've understood, you've made sense of what you're learning, it's all about consolidating it now. So now we have to make sure we don't forget the information that we have studied and we have learned. There is something called the generation effect, and that is you're much more likely to remember something if you've actively had to retrieve it yourself. So you've probably heard of active recall and spaced repetition, and you can't really do one without the other. So active recall is something that can be different for lots of different people. Some people like to use flashcards, that's a form of active recall. Anki, some people like to get a blank piece of paper and write everything down without looking at their notes. All of that is active recall. What I used to do when it came to my studying, each week I would set aside one specific date that I would call the end of week review. And that is where I would revisit all the content that I've learned in that previous week. So during the end of week review, so that one day I would not learn any new content. It was purely dedicated to recalling information and assessing myself and making sure that I've actually understood what I have learned in that previous week. When I say revisit, I don't mean rereading my notes or highlighting or just rewriting my notes even, because we know that those are very passive ways of learning and they're actually really ineffective. So what I would do is do questions specifically about the content that I've learned in that week. I'd be going through all of these questions, do the questions, and then start identifying bits, what are my weaknesses, where did I not do so well on, and then I would revisit the information, have a look at it again. And that is what's called active recall. This is the single most effective method in retaining information and making sure that you retain information. And the problem people always fall into is they do a bunch of questions, they think they've done their active recall and think, right, I know it now, but don't actually repeatedly recall information. And that's what spaced repetition is all about. My other active recall technique would be Eli 5. If you're on Reddit or you've been on Reddit, you may know that this is explain it to me like I'm 5 years old. What I would do is with 1 or 2 friends, we would put on a Google sheet pre-prepared topics that we wanted to explain to each other in that end of week review, explain concepts to each other. So for me personally, I would always set aside topics that I found really difficult to explain or really difficult to understand. Then with my friends, we would literally give each other feedback. So, you didn't explain this well enough to me. I feel like there's still gaps in your knowledge, or you've not simplified the concept enough to me. So then I'll be like, yes, okay, I'm going to have to go back and, revisit the information. And that way you're much more likely to know whether you've fully understood something. So the next thing I wanted to discuss was something called multiple encoding. Multiple encoding would be something I would use when I was actually learning new content. So this was not during exam season, but more just when you've learned something new. So we have to kind of talk about how we actually encode information, and memory is actually encoded through different means. So there's visual, so that's through images, diagrams, pictures, that type of thing. Then there's auditory, which is through hearing, and then there's something called semantic, which is where you memorize things through words. I would use these different processes depending on the content that I was learning, if that makes any sense. So for example, when I would use visual encoding, when I knew something was really fact heavy, or there was a topic that just had a lot of moving parts that was quite complicated and I really wanted to simplify it for myself. For example, the management of asthma has a lot of information. You can see I'm scrolling through this. So the management includes different inhalers that they need to take, different medications, depending on their lung capacity, depending on how severe their symptoms are, depending on their age. So you can see all this is like a wall of text, and it doesn't look particularly appealing to the eye. So what I would do with this kind of information is to break it down into more manageable parts, is to turn all of this into some kind of a diagram, some kind of a diagrammatic format that just looks a little bit more easy on the eye. So you can see here, I put it kind of almost into a flowchart and literally just condensed all that information, got rid of the filler words, got rid of all the jargon and all the kind of unnecessary verbosity of the text, and just condensed it down to its real key points. So this is one way of doing it, so through diagrams or kind of visual representations. And then there's auditory. So when would I use that? So again, if there was something I didn't quite understand, it was this really complicated concept and I just can't get my head around it, I should lecture about someone talking about it. And sometimes just the way they've worded it or the way they've explained it in slightly more simpler terms can be that light bulb moment. I'm like, yes, okay, I've understood this now. And then there's semantic. So with this, I don't mean just reading textbooks. What I mean is sometimes you have to use multiple sources to look at the same information. So you've used one textbook, and again, this is concept you don't quite understand, that you don't really know the intricacies of it. So what I used to do was I would literally use Wikipedia, have a read of the explanation on there, and it's often much more simpler. Every textbook or source approaches something from a slightly different angle, and just that slightly different perspective can be, again, that light bulb moment that you're like, ooh, okay, I've understood this now. So this is when you're taking advantage of the way in which we process information. Last is replication. I think we often forget that whilst we're studying, our information for our exam, that we kind of forget the actual exam itself, because that in itself requires practice. What I used to do was the last week or so before an exam, I would try and make sure I'm not learning any new content anymore. I would really focus on mimicking the exam conditions, because we often forget that there is a pressure of time, being able to get through the exam comfortably at a comfortable pace and still having a couple of minutes to spare. Then there's the pressure of sustained focus. So, you know, sometimes papers can be an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes even more. And then there's a pressure of not getting tired out whilst you're in the exam. So it's really important to start preparing yourself for the exam conditions. There are little tricks that can help you practice for the exam more. So for example, if you know your exam is going to be at 9 o'clock in the morning, do a question paper at 9 o'clock in the morning. If you know your exam is going to be an hour long, try and do at least 1 or 2 practice papers, practice exams that last the same amount of time as the actual exam itself. It will also help you practice being able to keep to time. So how long do I need to spend on each question? Is it going to be a minute? Is it going to be 2 minutes? And then also being able to stay focused for long periods of time. That requires practice as well. So it's really important, a week or so before the exam, that you really set aside and try and mimic the exam conditions as much as possible. Anyway guys, I think that's everything. I've been rambling on for quite a long time now. Hope that was even a little bit useful. And like always, if you really enjoyed the video or you've took something from it, even if it's a small thing, please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, because it will really help me grow. And I'll see you in the next video.